As far as social media was concerned, he was an ideal husband, essentially. So for him to have come forward with, I'm having an affair and I'm leaving you, or even just, I'm leaving you, we're getting a divorce, period, is certainly a big swing from the perfect family that, he had basically been a part of presenting to the world for a number of years at that point. We don't know how that may have played into his ultimate decision to kill his children and his wife instead of simply leaving.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. That clip you've just heard is from Suburban Nightmare. It is from a psychologist speaking at about 1 hour 17 minutes into the 1 hour 25-minute documentary. It played on Tubi not that long ago. And just to review, the psychologist makes the following statement. She says, as far as social media was concerned, he was an ideal husband, essentially. So for him to come forward with, I'm having an affair and I'm leaving you, or even just, I'm leaving you, we're getting a divorce, period, is certainly a big swing from the perfect family that he had, basically been a part of presenting to the world. And at that point, the scene cuts to Chris Watts playing Santa Claus for a number of years at that point. We don't know how that may have played into his ultimate decision to kill his children and his wife instead of simply leaving. Really? Don't we know how that played into his decision? I thought we did know. And we'll deal with this decision, this ultimate decision to kill his children and wife, which in true crime is known as motive. We'll be dealing with that in this episode. Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Like, share, leave a comment, and let's get started. So I think there's an important reason why she says they don't know the answer. And I think it's because ordinary psychology isn't quite the same as criminal psychology. And I think psychologists will acknowledge that. I think they will say, yes, that is a fair assessment. So Rebecca Osei, the clinical psychologist, is the blonde woman who I played at the beginning of this episode. I wonder whether she'd agree if one said psychology is going to get you some way to understanding how people think and operate. But criminal psychology is a different discipline. You may have experienced many psychologies in your work as a clinical psychologist, but you've probably never had a criminal, after they've murdered, after they've turned to the dark side, as part of your clinical practice. And so realistically, do you have a track record or experience with criminal psychology? Another psychologist in the documentary, also in the final third of the documentary, acknowledged that's the problem. We don't really know who he really was. And that's a reference to Chris Watts.
And so that's the problem, is that we don't really know who he was because he spent so much time in a play performing this act.
So to shorten that, what this psychologist, his name's Barry Cartman, he says, that's the problem. We don't really know who he really was. And then he also makes a comment saying, he was kind of caught up in an act, in a performance. But what about Shanann's social media, the multi-level marketing? Wasn't that a bit of an act as well? Presenting things in a certain way, curated social media, that's not quite a reflection of what's really happening in the family. And so when this psychologist says he's a mental health advocate, Obari, when he says we don't really know who he really was, that may be true, and that is a problem. But what about Shanann? Do we know who she really was based on her social media? But coming back to his point, I think that is exactly the problem. The psychology is facile and superficial. By the way, those two traits are also traits of narcissists. Narcissists are shallow and have a simplistic view of things, a simplistic view of people, a shallow view of people. Their relationships are simplistic and shallow. They have an oversimplified view of situations and people. The FBI expert in the final third of the documentary, who you'd think would have a good handle on criminal psychology, says something about Chris Watts finally telling the truth during his second confession.
He's in prison. When then he makes this final confession where he says, okay, here's what really happened.
So the narrator of this documentary, a woman at about 1 hour, 16 minutes into it, also says this time, meaning that second interview in Wisconsin, I think it was in sort of middle of February, she says, then he finally decided to tell the truth, right? Really? Did he? I'm sure Chris Watts revealed a lot more than during the first confession, including that he was responsible for what happened to the girls and not Shanann. But he lied about other things. He certainly didn't come clean. He didn't tell the whole truth. One of the things he lied about was where he said, I told her I didn't love her anymore, and that's when it happened. In other words, that he actually had a conversation with Shanann that morning.
I felt very good in the bed. She started rubbing her hand on me, and we ended up having sex. When I woke up later on in the morning, I pretty much told her, I didn't think it was going to work anymore. And she was like, what happened? What was last night? She was like, I knew there was somebody else. I knew there was somebody else. There was somebody else.
So the version you're getting in this documentary in 2022, almost 4 years after the fact, is that, the second confession is absolutely true. Well, for one thing, Chris Watts and Shanann never had a conversation or an argument on the night of the incident. The murder was committed in order to avoid a conversation or argument. This would be self-evidently true if you were able to spend just a little bit of time peering around the corner of the narcissism wall, around that huge narcissism label that has been sort of surrounding Chris Watts. If you just looked around that corner, you might see the dimension to Chris Watts that those who knew him saw and experienced. But it's an aspect you never really hear the blowhards talking about because, I don't know, maybe it lacks a certain zing. Maybe it doesn't sound sexy enough when you're on a true crime episode and things have got to be shocking and sensational. So, the expert is trying to sound very clever, and to say something like Chris Watts was an introvert, it doesn't sound like you're an expert. It just sounds pretty ordinary. But Chris Watts was an introvert. His wife knew it and said it. She even said it on social media. So did the Lindstroms, and both his family and hers knew Chris's introverted personality through and through. Nicole Kessinger also knew him as an introvert, and she described him as becoming slightly less introverted during their relationship, but still an introvert. Introverts don't like confrontation. Chris Watts couldn't bear the thought of a confrontation in which there was no escape. He knew he was the bad guy in terms of what had already happened. There was no excuse for what he was doing. His wife was pregnant. It had been his idea. And yet, despite all of this, he still intended to keep his mistress and lose his wife. That was his intention. So there was no silver lining for Shanann. There was no silver lining for him. So in effect, as an introvert, he preferred murder where he could control the outcome than a confrontation where he couldn't. And he would almost certainly lose that confrontation. And you might say, I wouldn't mind having that confrontation. I would talk about it. But you're not an introvert. You're not Chris Watts. And that is what Chris Watts did and how Chris Watts felt, not how you would have handled that situation. When Chris Watts told detectives in Wisconsin that he woke up that morning and had no control over it, the fact that he mentions control is a big clue to his psychology, even though control is absolutely part and parcel of criminal psychology kind of in general. It's how the powerless and socially inept, those with very low social status, gain power and gain control over their own weak narratives and weak status. You see this in case after case after case. And we will see whether it is proved, where it is demonstrated in the Barry Morphew case.
I told her I didn't love her anymore. That's what happened. What happened? I don't even want to say it felt like I had to. I just felt like there was already something in my mind that was implanted that I was going to do it. And I woke up that morning, it was going to happen, and I had no control of it.
when Watts says that morning it was going to happen and I had no control over it, it's actually an inversion. Now he was in control, and now he knew what was going to happen. He knew with Shanann, with where he was going to put the kids. He knew with the unenrolling the kids from school that he was going to be in charge of the finances, better in charge of the finances. He knew that he was going to be the one calling the realtor, and he was going to have the control over the sale of the house and the proceeds of the house and where he was going to live and how he was going to live. And what he was trying to do was get all the obstacles out of the way so he could be with Nicole Kessinger. It wasn't that he had no control. It was that he had finally regained total control. The problem was that he'd given away all control earlier. And the reason he'd given it away was because of his personality and because of the personality dynamic of their relationship as a couple. The problem was that because of his own personality and Shanann's personality, she had assumed total control over everything. Now, that's not Shanann's fault, but you could sort of say it's both their faults. He shouldn't have allowed it to happen, and it shouldn't kind of have taken place to the extent that it did. I also don't believe that Watts woke up, quote unquote, woke up that morning, because I don't think he ever went to sleep, and neither did Shanann. So I think if you know Chris Watts as a person instead of as a label, and the label being the narcissist, I think you can see and you can answer that question on how that may have played into his ultimate decision to kill his children and wife. Well, it is how did his introversion play into his ultimate decision to do what he did instead of simply leaving. There's another major problem with the final third of this documentary. Watts knew Shanann suspected an affair. We know she did. We know he was having an affair. We also know Watts was totally smitten with Kessinger. He said he'd never met anyone like her in his whole life, and he said he didn't know women like her existed. He was really head over heels. He even said that he was addicted to her. So we also know there's no way Watts would have slept with Shanann on that night, given that he'd not slept with her once while they were in North Carolina. And he'd rejected her advances and ended up sleeping on the couch and in the basement just after their return from North Carolina and prior to her departure again from Arizona. So he didn't want to have sex with Shanann, and it wasn't just because he'd made up his mind that he didn't want to be in a relationship with Shanann, and he'd communicated that to her. He didn't have sex with her also because he didn't want to be in a marriage. It wasn't just that. He'd also promised Kessinger that his divorce from Shanann was being finalized. And so when Shanann returned that night, that final night, he was desperate to make that happen. It was kind of his last chance to make that happen. And the last thing he was going to do is fall asleep and then sleep with someone he'd been planning to murder for days, as well as the fetus. He tried to poison the fetus for weeks. So besides this, he'd slept with the new love of his life prior to the day before, on the Saturday night. I think he slept with Kessinger based on the discovery prior to and I think after eating at the Lazy Dog. And then he'd communicated with Kessinger throughout Sunday afternoon, and I think they'd just had a 111-minute conversation prior to Shanann arriving home. They had a long conversation, and you should compare the conversation Watts had with Kessinger to the conversation he either had or didn't have with Shanann. Do you think after a 111-minute conversation with his mistress, he'd have much to say to his wife? And by some accounts, they even had phone sex during that 111-minute conversation. And I think he was still high on his mistress when Shanann arrived back. He wasn't interested in Shanann. And I think if there were seminal fluids, I think one would think that it would have been mentioned in the forensic report. It would have been found on the sheets and probably in Shanann's underwear. It would have been mentioned in the autopsy. Something that I think is also relevant is that Barry Morphew also claims that he had sex with Suzanne basically on the night that she probably died, but just immediately prior to her disappearance. And is there any evidence of that? There are also sheets that have been washed. There's also telemetry that doesn't really match up with Barry's statements. In other words, telemetry and cell phone data that doesn't quite match up with his timeline. And we saw the exact same thing with Chris Watts, where he later changed the time from getting up at 5 o'clock to getting up at 4 o'clock. Why? Because, well, when did you have this conversation? When were you able to do all the other things following that conversation?
I mean, as far as social media was concerned, he was an ideal husband, essentially.
So, in conclusion, I want to address Ms. Osei's statement in more detail. She says, as far as social media was concerned, he was an ideal husband, essentially. Whose social media? He wasn't presenting himself as an ideal husband on social media. Shanann was presenting him as an ideal husband, giving him shirts to wear and posing him in certain situations. You know, he didn't even do his own social media on Facebook. Shanann was doing that as well. The whole big mansion on the Colorado prairie as opposed to little house on the prairie, living large, driving a Lexus they couldn't afford, selling the Thrive spiel while their marriage was going to hell. That was Shanann's idea. She was the driving force. And clearly she was digging in despite the fact that he told her that they weren't compatible. And I always find it fascinating the way the phone data review, dealing with exactly what Chris and Shanann said to one another, that just seems to be left out of these narratives. Because, you know, they say, why didn't he just get a divorce? Well, he was asking for that. He told her he wanted a divorce. And to back that up, he slept separately from her, and he gave her the cold shoulder for most of that trip. That was as if to say, you know what, I'm not just saying that I feel we're incompatible, I am acting on that. You know, we are starting to separate. And that is why Shanann described that as the worst summer ever. Obviously, in text messages, she didn't say that on her Facebook because of the way he was treating her. And yet on her social media, up until the day she left Arizona, and even in Arizona, Shanann was still putting a big smile on the situation. She was still thriving with a capital T. Shanann didn't accept that Watts had told her, that he didn't want to be married to her anymore, didn't want the baby. He was quite clear about that as well. And she tried to override it by writing him a love letter and saying, you know, I'll never stop loving you. And then also taking him along to the ultrasound and also ordering him a self-help book. He wasn't interested. But Shanann was also not interested in listening to what he had to say. I think she was used to, because he was an introvert, she was used to overriding what he would say. And she would then get her way. She also insisted on doing the gender reveal that Monday, in spite of everything that was going on. And so you can see how in Watts's introverted mind and personality, this was kind of an emergency situation. If he was going to keep his mistress, he had to regain control. And he did it the moment Shanann arrived back. He delayed it until the last minute. And yet you never, ever hear anything about Shanann's narcissism. And if you do say something about it, you're victim blaming. You're not allowed to say anything about Shanann that's not positive. It doesn't matter if it's true, but if it's not positive, then you're doing something really wrong. You're blaming her. But it's got nothing to do with what was actually taking place. I mean, what do you think about the whole thing about having this really big house, one of the biggest houses in that neighborhood, living beyond their means, not being able to afford it, wanting things she really couldn't afford, even, insisting on a marriage and having 3 children despite having lupus. You can talk about Chris Watts' narcissism. You can say he was married and he was having an affair. That's narcissistic. That he was looking better and all that. That is part of the equation. But there's also Shanann's narcissism. In effect, both of their narcissism cancels one another's out. I don't think you can say the one person's narcissism stands head and shoulders, especially not the perpetrators, above the other person's.
So for him to have come forward with, I'm having an affair and I'm leaving you, or even just, I'm leaving you, we're getting a divorce, period, is certainly a big swing from the perfect family that, you know, he had basically been a part of presenting to the world for a number of years at that point.
Yes, this was a big swing from the perfect family picture, but that swing would be a much bigger deal for Shanann, who was living and breathing life into the happy family fallacy every day on her social media. It was her livelihood. It was all about showing how much they were thriving. It wasn't Watts' livelihood. He worked on the oil fields. In fact, he told his co-workers that he was none too happy with the medical bills he was paying, and although he kept the third pregnancy secret from some of his colleagues, to others he expressed misgivings. I think he even jokingly suggested giving the baby away. If you go to Discovery page 756, where Anthony Brown said Watts made a comment to him a few months ago which Brown thought was unusual. Brown said he and Watts were at a location called Arrowhead Farms, and they were in the process of getting the site ready to start pumping oil again. Brown said that Watts had told him that he and Shanann were expecting a baby. Brown said he told Watts congratulations, and Watts said in return, do you want one? And Brown said Watts made this comment with no emotion, and Watts didn't appear to be very excited about having another baby. Brown said he thought Watts was offering him their baby. Brown said he thought Watts was kidding, but Brown said that after the recent incident surrounding Watts, Brown wondered if Watts was being serious about giving away his baby. So does that sound like this big swing from Chris Watts lying about and trying to present a perfect family picture to the outside world? Or is he fairly honest about it? Not completely honest about it, but certainly to some of his colleagues sort of allowing for certain misgivings about how he felt. And I think even Nicole Atkinson said she was sort of surprised because she didn't really hear from Shanann while Shanann was in North Carolina. And so she didn't really know about how bad things were in North Carolina because Shanann wasn't confiding in Nicole while they were in North Carolina. She was talking to Addie and Christina Meacham.
I don't know how that may have played into his ultimate decision to kill his children and his wife instead of simply leaving.
As I say, I think we do know how the dynamics played into his ultimate decision. And we know because we've gone below the surface to find out who Chris Watts was as a person. In that area, I'd say my series of books is definitive in peeling away the operative criminal psychology. If you would like to know more about that, I've written a book, Silver Fox Post-Truth, in which I talk about the sort of final assessment, the final take on what happened and why it happened. So if you're interested in that, I'll put a link in the description to the book. It's available in paperback. It's available on Kindle, Kindle Unlimited, and also as an audiobook on Patreon. There are some really interesting intertextualities between the Chris Watts case and the Barry Morphew case. Did you know that Barry also said that he barbecued on the night that Suzanne disappeared? And, you know, when the police asked, well, why was there only one plate? He said, well, we shared one plate. And I think you had a similar situation with Chris Watts, also barbecued. Obviously, she wasn't home at that point, but he also chose to barbecue that night, which kind of means he also made a fire, which I think is quite interesting. There's also interesting intertextualities with the laundry, CCTV footage, metadata, cell phone data, text messages, all that kind of thing. So I'm going to be doing a live stream tomorrow. That's Tuesday afternoon, around about 4 or 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We're going to be going through the Barry Morphew affidavit step by step. I've already put up the first episode quite a long time ago, but we're going to continue with this in lieu of the court case that's approaching in about 2 months' time, towards sort of the end of April. So I'll be doing a series on the Morphew affidavit every Tuesday, and then don't miss the series on Vincent van Gogh every Wednesday, also 4 or 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.
It's free. There's no monthly website cost. There's no monthly, nothing you have to pay for to promote.